Why are Americanized cultures obsessed with the 1980s?
When are you gonna let the 80s go?
Never! The 80s will always be the best decade.
This is a phenomenon that truly transcends mere nostalgia and even extends to generations that never even lived through the 1980s. Why is this? Is 80s culture really worth the hype, or is it profoundly overrated? In this series, I am examining each decade as if it were a stage of grief, and as such, the 1980s is denial.
I don't believe it.
That is why you fail.
Denial is the stage of grief that occurs after the initial shock has worn off. One may psychologically cope with the loss by denying it has occurred altogether. I am comparing the stages of grief to genres of fiction to really hammer in the message. I have said that the shock stage of the 1970s was science fiction. While obviously sci-fi still exists in the following decades, the tone of it changes significantly. Whereas in the 70s, aliens were shocking and horrifying creatures, in the 1980s, aliens were largely portrayed in a cute and friendly way, such as E.T., Alf,
By the way, you're out of Tic Tacs.
or the Ewoks from Return of the Jedi. Far from being paralyzed by the threat of these aliens, the aliens were viewed as harmless and welcomed in with open arms. I would say that fantasy is the genre that best reflects the 1980s. Even most of the science fiction of the 1980s tended to be more of a hybrid of sci-fi and fantasy. Shock was no longer the trend, and denial was setting in. Instead of acknowledging the painful transformation occurring in the culture, it was far more comforting to escape into a fantasy world. Video games moved away from the spooky outer space theme and entered the realms of Mario's Mushroom Kingdom and Zelda's Hyrule. Music moved away from the explosive nature of shock rock and themes of the unknown and moved towards more fantastical themes. Soothing synth-filled ballads, and overall, a more positive, whimsical vibe. Finally, the 80s was full of fantasy movies, my personal favorites being Labyrinth,
You have no power over me.
and The Princess Bride.
But in the meantime, rest well and dream of large women.
I mentioned in the 70s video that the culture reacted to America's conquering of the globe as being akin to an alien invasion, something people were not quite prepared for. The 80s, by contrast, viewed this takeover as a good thing. There is no decade more emblematic of American patriotism than the 1980s. You can probably envision a boomer you know, or at least a stereotype you can imagine of one, who is sitting on his lawn, blasting Born in the USA, and whose favorite film is Top Gun. This brand of patriotism has a distinct 80s flavor to it. Denial doesn't just mean a failure to acknowledge reality. It is also a state of rebellion. Denial, as in denying authority. This denial of authority is present in the pseudo-libertarianism of the decade. The character of John Rambo is a good demonstration of this 80s denial archetype. First Blood is one of my favorite 80s movies, and is all about denying authority, and portrays the authorities in a very negative light. First Blood is also about denial in the other sense, as Rambo is literally and figuratively running away from his grief. And it's only at the end that he breaks down in tears and has to come to grips with his trauma as a war veteran.
And nobody would help.
it doesn't quite sit right with me that the second Rambo film just makes Rambo essentially a pawn to further American global interests. It seems a bit insidious to me how they subverted the original movie.
The war, everything that happened here may be wrong, but damn it, don't hate your country for it.
Hey, I die for it.
And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free.
This duality of Rambos is the very thing that makes assessing American culture difficult.
You think you're bad like Rambo? Well, I had the Tambo Rambos that make Rambo look like the Pambos.
As it is very two-faced. One side talking about how great freedom is and standing up for the lone person who just wants to eat lunch and live peacefully, and the other side preparing to invade other nations while treating their own citizens as fodder. The 80s is when Americanization was at its peak, and the population seemed to be in full support of the regime at this time. At least, that is what the common perception seems to be. There was a consensus among the people in the 80s that the culture was in a good place at the time. By contrast, today, most people despise so-called popular music, and movies and video games are highly divisive. In the 2020s, everyone is divided and polarized. Whereas in the 80s, everyone could agree that Bon Jovi was at least an alright band, Mario was a fun game, and The Empire Strikes Back was a decent movie. In the 2020s, even most young people say that older music is better than the current stuff, and liking or disliking a new movie or new video game is synonymous with making a political statement. This says to me that America is in a precarious position in the 2020s, when large segments of the population are reacting with hostility to every single new Disney product. That is a sign that their values do not align with the people who are making these movies. In the 80s and 90s, most people had the consensus that Disney movies were unanimously liked, and at the time, liking or disliking a Disney film was just considered personal preference. Whereas today, your preference is considered an indication of your tribal allegiance. Now I'm gonna say something here that's quite controversial, so it requires some context. The controversial statement is as follows: everything is political. All art is political, and therefore, all art can be interpreted as propaganda. Before anyone has a knee-jerk reaction to this, I am not saying this to belittle art. I love art. And also, just because something is true, it does not mean it is the only lens to view things through. It is also a true statement to say everything is food. However, it should be obvious that perpetually viewing everything as food is a messed up lens to view reality through and should not be adopted as anything more than a thought experiment. Likewise, viewing all art as propaganda is a dangerous lens to wear at all times. However, it is also a very useful lens to look through for this series. So entertain this lens, but don't let it consume you. There is a prevalent idea that things are now woke, and that things were not woke back in the 80s and 90s. This might very well be true, but I think that many of the people saying this have this false belief that woke entertainment is propaganda, whereas the 80s and 90s media was somehow not propaganda. In reality, the entertainment of the past was no less propagandistic than the woke stuff of today. For these anti-woke types, the art of the 80s and 90s was merely propaganda that they agree with.
You've never been out of college. You don't know what it's like out there. I've worked in the private sector. They expect results.
Or if it was something they disagreed with, at the very least, the propaganda was subtle enough that they could stomach it or ignore it.
I have decided to allow my child to choose its own sex and appearance.
People are quick to shout propaganda when something offends them, while ignoring the propaganda in the things that they like. One thing that always seems consistent with anti-woke types is that they all seem to love the 1980s, and they usually uphold the 80s as a golden age for entertainment and art, even though the 80s is the most guilty of the very things the anti-woke types complain about. The only difference is that America is just far less competent in the 2020s with their messaging than they were in the 1980s. Propaganda has become a lost art. I believe this anti-woke movement is largely an example of denial, a yearning to return to the 80s. The media of the 80s was very similar to the messaging of today. It was just far more compelling and overall more wholesome in its approach. Today, the tone is much more hostile and egregious to most people's sensibilities. But make no mistake, the messaging was nearly identical. I'd like to do a little analysis here of a short film that came out in 2015 called Kung Fury. This is a movie where the explicit theme is the 1980s. Every single facet of Kung Fury embodies the 80s. The characters...
Hacker Man. He's the most powerful hacker of all time.
The music... The plot...
Or you're off the case!
I'm not off the case. I quit.
The setting... The visuals, everything. Literally, the only joke in Kung Fury is, haha, this is so 80s. This is like how things were in the 80s.
This revolution in communication could make it possible for more and more people to have a phone in their car.
When Kung Fury first dropped back in 2015, I was forced to watch it with a room full of Gen Xers, who, of course, thought it was the funniest thing ever made. I wasn't super impressed myself, but then again, I am not the target demographic. If you are a boomer, Gen X, or just a young person who believes they were born in the wrong generation, you will likely love Kung Fury. It is just one giant meme about how 80s the 80s was.
Who are you?
Sparbariana.
But as someone who grew up on Family Guy, I find this secondhand 80s nostalgia a bit tiresome.
Your 80s nostalgia isn't funny anymore. It's tired and worn out.
Even back in 2015, I was already getting tired of it. However, I think that Kung Fury reveals a lot more about the 80s and the denial of the time than you would initially expect. It demonstrates just how effective America was at propaganda back in the 80s. So, in this film that is the essence of the 80s in its purest form, who is the villain? It's Hitler. Literally Hitler. I am not joking. The villain is actually Hitler. The plot is that a kung fu cop has to go back in time to kill Hitler.
I'm a cop from the future. I was sent back in time to kill Hitler.
This is obviously so ridiculous and fantastical that many may not even realize the political nature of this short film, especially since many 80s movies actually did have Nazis as the villains, most famously the first and third Indiana Jones films. It is such a common trope in American media to have the Germans as the bad guys that no one even bats an eye at the idea of Hitler being the villain of Kung Fury, a movie that's only purpose is to reflect the 1980s. Now I know it's easy to write this off as just a dumb meme and not read too much into it, but really think about how strange this is outside of an American context. If you don't think that Kung Fury is political, replace the yelling German man with Karl Marx or Ayn Rand, and it becomes obvious how politically charged it is. The choice of villain implies the political message. There is something so fitting and so American about the plot of Kung Fury literally being about going back in time to kill Hitler. America is always acting as if it is the underdog. America is in denial that they are and have been the establishment, and must go as far as to resurrect defeated foes in order to pursue this ridiculous notion.
They're not just zombies, they're Nazi zombies.
Nazi zombies.
Nazi zombies don't want to eat you just because they're craving the protein. They do it because they hate Americans, man.
Kung Fury is not a movie that anyone would ever call woke, but it is one of the most blatantly propagandistic works of fiction I have ever seen. It is literally anti-fascist propaganda, explicitly and extravagantly. It is as overindulgent as something like Inglourious Bastards. And whether you agree with this messaging or not, it is undoubtedly propaganda. Yet, many of these anti-woke types would watch Kung Fury and say, "Oh yes, I wish we could go back to the 80s before everything got all political." Kung Fury is propaganda, but it's well done propaganda. It's effective because it doesn't upset anyone. The Triceratops cop doesn't lecture the main character about his human privilege or attend a Dinosaur Lives Matter rally, so it's all well and good for average Joe who loves the 80s. Despite the blatant political messaging hitting you over the head, it will likely not be noticed by most people. Kung Fury harkens back to an era where everyone was on board with the regime. Everyone could just enjoy the laser raptors and the hot Viking babes. They could be dazzled by the style and thus not be looking into the substance. As American culture transformed over the following decades, it seems we have become more self-aware, and many long to escape back into the fantasy that was the American dream. This is the allure of the 80s. And I'm not just here to judge people who long for the 80s. There have even been times that I have longed for it myself. And how can one not, when every older person hypes up the 80s as the greatest time ever? I will likely get a lot of backlash for this video, and maybe even get called some mean names. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the 80s is so often over-idolized, and how this can be a bad thing. I have a difficult time imagining a Kung Fury type movie being made about any other decade, and I believe this is because reliving the decades of shock or anger or depression does not make a very good escape. Denial is the only escapist stage of grief. It is the only stage that has a broader appeal to it even when you are outside of it, which is why 80s nostalgia is not going away anytime soon. It is an escape into a fantasy, not just in the fiction genre sense, but also in the collective zeitgeist sense, as in the fantasy of the American dream. The fantasy that sheer effort will allow you to achieve your dreams. The fantasy that we can all get along. The fantasy that we are the rebels as well as the good guys. These are all fantasies, but we'd all like them to be true, myself included. It is tempting to just believe in the Kung Fury world. It's simple and fun. Things make sense. It's how we view how things ought to be. But it's not real.
It's fiction. It's fiction. We made it up. We made this one up. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication.
As Kung Fury itself is a product of the 2010s, you might be wondering if this contradicts my stages theory. Shouldn't Kung Fury be a work of the Depression era, you may ask? Well, yes. Yes, it is. Even Kung Fury has an irony to it. For instance, there is a message about teamwork at one point, but it comes off like it's making fun of the message of teamwork being super cheesy rather than anything genuine.
Teamwork is very important.
It lacks the sincerity that an actual 80s movie has.
'Cause I'm the real article. What you see is what you get.
The 2010s was when 80s nostalgia was at its peak, I do believe. But perhaps I'll save that for the 2010s video. Nonetheless, I do believe that Kung Fury exposes the 80s in a rather naked way that they likely did not intend, and it's an interesting case study. I'll also note that Kung Fury is not just some obscure thing. It has millions of views and is well beloved. It really taps into people's obsession with the 80s.
I need some sort of time machine.
It truly was the decade of the American dream. A dream many still long to drift back into, and it's fine to do so from time to time. I don't want to seem as though I'm painting it as an inherently negative thing that you have to avoid at all times. It's more that it's important to just have awareness that it is a dream. When Journey first sang, "Don't stop believing, hold on to that feeling," I wonder if anyone thought people would still be holding on to that feeling 40 years later. We now have multiple generations who jumped on clouds as Mario and rescued the princess from the dragon. And fantasy is still a popular genre of fiction, though it's become less dreamlike and more something out of a nightmare to remain relevant. I think of all the stages of grief, denial is the only one that seems to linger on well past its expiry date. For better or worse, the specter of the 1980s still haunts everything in American culture. On one hand, I can empathize. I do quite like the fantasy aesthetic, and I understand the allure of nostalgia, as I have a fair bit of fondness for the early 2000s myself. But on the other hand, I am sick of the cultural stagnation. From the hauntological nature of music, especially in the metal scene, to all indie video games being a Metroidvania or some other nostalgia bait. Are we just eternally stuck in the past? George Orwell was perhaps even more on point than he could have imagined. We literally continuously live in 1984. If you want a vision of the future, imagine an Outrun screensaver on loop forever. Outrun is a fitting name for this aesthetic, as the 80s denial phase is all about trying to outrun reality. Despite my harshness towards all this, I know this nostalgic reverence is an aspect of human nature and can be utilized in healthy ways. But it would be nice if we could create something new, rather than clinging on to 40-year-old aesthetics forever. The American world does not possess the same prosperity that it did back then, and we can no longer afford to stay in denial. The 80s was a fantastical realm we should remember, but not get lost in. It may be a good memory, but it is not our home. It is just a step on the journey.
Don't stop believing.
Next time, I will tackle the anger era of the 1990s, where it was becoming obvious the dream was fading. And people were getting really pissed off.
We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars. But we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off.
Our occulturation continues.